what is my history as a Black Filipino person, right? And it starts with the military. And so I was like, what is the history of Black folks going into the military? And you look at these Calvaries, right, that were first segregated, but also like how Black folks were recruited to be in the military to go to the Philippines.
What's up, everybody? I go by the name of Domo.
And I go by the name of Yoshiko.
And each week, we sit down with cultural ambassadors
to talk about how they defied societal norms
to live their lives
with no blueprint.
Right now, I'm exploring who I am as an auntie and as a person that is delving into their feelings of fear. That's my soul and my family. That's who I am. So my soul right now is exploring fear. My family identity is like exploring who I am as an auntie and as a person that's not going to have kids, and like how that is interpreted in the world as a 40-year-old person. When I think about racial dynamics in the United States, I'm a mixed race, queer, cisgendered, Black and Filipino woman of color. When I think about the identity that brings me joy, I think about myself as a teacher, as a constant learner, as a person that's learning how people learn, and like that being a foundational, amazing thing that helps you explore life in a different way. Because like I think that is how we can change the world, is if we learn how people learn, because then you understand how people understand things so that they can unlearn things or relearn things. Before I became like a teacher here, specifically at Seattle Girls School, I was a community organizer and community educator. I feel like those are still like what my soul, I think some people would say that's an activist, but I think everybody's an activist, right? Because if you fight for something, it depends on how you fight for something. But a community organizer is different. So I still feel like I hold on to that identity, and it's hard for me to be an activist how it's defined in this world because of ability things. That's really hard. You know, I can't be out pounding the pavement. People are like, we need to pound the pavement. I was like, you don't know about these feet and my ankles and my hip and my back. I'm like, for real? Like, as a coming from a working class community, I was like, I want to survive beyond, 50. We're dying because of health concerns from 60. There's other things, so it's exciting when I'm a person that wants to live until they're 100. Right. That's the goal. And so that means that I'm 40%, almost 40% done with my life. Go by percentages, got 60 more % to live. I'm a person that's very youthful. People think, I want people to think that I'm old now, regardless of how I look, because I'm like, I want to be an auntie and I want to be old. I want people to ask me questions because I have gray hair. I'm like, well, let me tell you. But other than that, I'm like professionally, I've been a consultant. I've been a youth and young adult person. I've been a mentor. I've been an ate, which means a big sister. I've been Miss Lulu. I'm also a radio host, which is Lulu Nation. I think I'm a chameleon as I'm saying all these different identities. I am who I need to be in any given moment. That's what my mixed experience has taught me so that I can survive and thrive and support other people. And being a conscious bridge, not one that's stepped on. I hate that metaphor. Let's see. That's all for now. Yeah, and, I have a radio show, which, Lulu Nation and the Crew, Tuesdays 7 to 9, currently on Hollow Earth Radio, expanding, hopefully, with your help. Hey.
Nice.
Anti-gentrifier, but a gentrifier. I can go on, I use she and her pronouns. Listen,
go for it. No, first of all, this is an honor to be able to sit with you. I think when we were formulating this podcast, your name was one of the first names that came up. And I think I was
Yeah, you told me.
Yeah.
I was like, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to
Yeah,
help
we
you.
didn't- don't
I'm
worry,
trying to
we-
figure it out too.
listen, we didn't know what to do either, which is why I had to wait. I was like, let me wait until we halfway know what we're doing here before we sit down with you. And so before I ask about culture, I want can you run down and I'm gonna put you on the spot here. Can you run down some of the organizations that your name has been attached to?
There's not that many, you know that. I
Listen.
feel like I've supported some, but ones that I give honor to that
Yes.
have supported me are API Women and Family Safety Center, which is now API Chaya.
Shout out to ABHI.
Yep. API stands for Asian Pacific Islander. They taught me how about sexual assault, domestic violence, and sexual assault, sexual violence, and sexual trafficking, international and domestic. And that was foundational because then I learned about grassroots organizing, nonprofits, and also policy as well as community partnership. And that is the foundation. What is now called Gabriela Seattle. It's gone through different variations, but it's predominantly a Filipino women's organization, which taught me about community organizing and grassroots leadership, and specifically international solidarity in connection to Bayan USA. After that, it was like Communities Against Rape and Abuse, which is connected, which was an affiliate chapter of Insight, Women and Trans People Against Violence. And that taught me about like critical resistance and incarceration and like basically the complicated things that we need to go through, and what does community accountability mean, what does transformative justice mean, so that we're like, it's called carceral feminism, which the answer to justice is locking people up versus like what does justice look like. I think that's more complicated. And then that was big. Also, Ladies First was under that. It was a project. We did Nat Turner teach-ins through Cara. The women that started that organization taught me a lot about rape and rape culture. Other than that, I think everything has been like contracts. Everything has been contracts and contracts and contracts. You know, so it's like my name is attached to all these other things, but I'm like, mostly it's like people paid me, and so I did work for them. And I love them all, but I feel like those were the foundations of like helped my analysis of like why I understood my family in connection to violence, and what I understood liberation to mean, and how hard it was.
Right.
Besides that, I learned a lot about preservation and anti-gentrification through organizations like LELO that helped me get to Legacy of Equality and Labor Organizing, which was connected to tons of organizations that helped me get to the United States social forums when they first came out, like in Atlanta and then later in Detroit. Also helped me get to like Allied Media Conference and understand what media justice meant. And that was another framing of even why, you know, radio is so important. When I think of youth organizations that I supported, I think that's your list, where I've definitely like mentored and been big sister / ate, you know, in Filipino Tagalog language, which is like the Service Board, Seattle Young People's Project. Not really youth in doing institutional racism, but I would always send youth there. I worked at Franklin High School as a community projects manager. I worked at Youth Care through many of their programs, mostly the drop-in and like outreach, transitional programming. Worked on call at sometimes, you know, that 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift. You know, pick up a little change, talk to some youth. Yeah, I think that's all the youth organizations. Did I say Youth Speaks in Seattle Young People's Project? The Service Board, which was huge.
TSB.
The TSB, a huge influence for me. And just framing and understanding. And a lot of youth organizations have asked me to do different workshops, from Powerful Voices to All Girl, Everything, Age Up, Ultimate Frisbee. Oh, I've done contracts with Roots Young Adult Shelter. Yeah, I think that's it. And then did a lot of speaking engagements at tons of colleges and universities. Yes, I'm like looking up to the sky of like, God, can you help me? Did I forget anything?
Yeah.
Did I tell you that I was old again? It's been
I've got a million. Now I've got a million questions.
okay.
I like how you started with, oh, there's not a lot. I don't do a lot. And that was a lot.
Yes.
Sorry.
No.
The foundational ones and the
well,
ones that helped me support youth and young adults.
But this is
Great.
But
Yeah.
no, this is great because this is why we do it, right? So, how do you personally come to understand culture?
So, the first time I started to define culture is through KP, who's also known as Rogue Panay in the artist scene. They're a rapper, an entrepreneur, community activist, community organizer, and they were active in Gabriela Seattle, as well as Bayan and other organizations in the Filipino community, and API Chaya, as mentioned earlier. And they went to the Philippines and they came back and they identified themselves as a cultural worker, and they defined it as people have done for centuries there, where a cultural worker is somebody who shifts culture, because in order to combat like imperialism, in order to combat like racism and all types of oppression that cause violence, is like we created that culture, so we created a culture of violence, created a culture of rape, we created a culture of harm. And so art is a vehicle in which we can shift meaning, right? And so for me, culture is something that we create together. It's not just a given. There's things that are handed down to us. We see it historically. We can either reclaim that culture so that we can continue, but they're all vehicles so that we can find liberation together. Things that are culture is like language, an example of language being violent is like how people are forced to assimilate and learn a specific language, specifically English. We're just very monolingual here in the United States, and to give up their mother tongue, which had their cultural understanding, and most language is rooted in land. If you go to a specific country where it's just like things are grounded, things have meaning, a lot of words have story. Versus the English language, which is predominantly a trade language, which I love talking about, could go more in depth, and specifically how that could be a violent encounter. And instead, if we take language through poetry or through art, we can shift that paradigm of saying like that which is used to conquer me or make me feel less than because I don't know grammar or sentence structure, I'll actually use to bring liberation to my people through poetry and upliftment. That's an example. Or images that are used to, or visuals that are used to say we are conquerors, for example, or statues. So you go around and street names are named after the native folks or indigenous folks that are seen as no longer here or vanishing, and like how that's a colonizing force. Or like if we name or there's just statues of predominantly white cisgendered men, and that tells a story, right? That's a culture of dominance around us. But it was like, can we raise up different statues? Can we create different visuals? And when I think about culture specifically, when we think about those that are most marginalized, all we have is our bodies. So when we think about fashion, whether it's our nails or our hair or the clothing that we wear or the swag in which we carry our body, and we only have our body, that is our culture that we're wearing so that we can advertise we're like living, breathing statues walking around, juxtaposed to this environment of culture, So when I think about cultural shifting, it's like with our mouths, with our bodies, because often those are the only things that we're left with when we're like migrating from one country to another. Or when we think about slavery, right? It was just like, you can take everything away from me, but I'm a living, breathing person with, with my body, and I'm carrying my culture with me, my mother tongue, my body,
That's amazing.
Yeah. I have more to say about that, but I'm sorry. I just got on a train. I was
Listen,
like,
no,
and I was going Paulo Freire. So I was like, oh wait, I have to come back and say this thing. I need to come back and say this thing.
Being educated all day.
Right.
So I want to start. Let's start from the beginning.
Yeah, can we start with
where
upbringing?
where were you born? Where did you grow up?
Start
I'm
from
like,
day one.
Day one.
From the beginning.
Oh, I see. I was like, I thought this was gonna be a hard question, and it usually is because I saw a twinkle in your eye. I was like,
Okay.
because you're like, I can only see your eyes, and you're like, so tell me. And I thought it was like, hard question. Oh, baby status.
Oh, yes.
Okay. I was born as a Pisces. My birthday's March 10th, 1978. Please meet me at the Busch Gardens for my usual, if they're still in existence by then. My dad's from Jacksonville, Alabama. My mom's from Pampanga, Philippines, specifically Mexico City in the Philippines, not in Mexico. Yes, there's a Mexico City.
What?
Yes, the Spaniards colonized the Philippines as well as Mexico. So
I need to look up the history on that. That's
I feel like I'm throwing things in that distract me, so let me backtrack. So my dad's in Jacksonville, Alabama. He's African American. He has some native blood inside of him. We just learned about this, just mentioning that because people from the South are like, oh, he's a little bit light skinned, you know. And it's just kind of like, you're like, oh, you know, it's so interesting depending on what region you're in, what's considered light skin to black folks. So he was raised on a cotton plantation with his brothers and sisters. All the brothers, all my uncles predominantly went into the military. All my aunties kind of stayed at home, ended up being in that area. There was a Walmart. There's a prison nearby. It's a really tiny town, and there's lots of cotton plantations. Wow. So my dad's was the last generation to pick cotton. He did that in high school. That formed my identity a lot. And then he went into the military. The military base is now shut down.
Okay.
And so then he went from there. He met my mom, and revealing family secrets. She was pregnant at the time, I learned. That's how my family rolls. Like, that's why I love stories. Like, it's so important because your families hide so much trauma because they think it's better for you and it's worse. So
my soul right now.
My brother was born, so he was the first of 4 kids. They were married in a courthouse somewhere. They had all 3 kids, Don, Michelle, and Junior. And then I guess I was a little seedling inside my mom's tummy when she was migrating to the United States. Then I was born in Mountain Home, Idaho Air Force Base. So yeah, I was like in Idaho on a military base as a mixed girl. My brother has tons of stories that also formed. You know those stories that your family tells you that you look back now and they're like, that's kind of tragic, you know, like telling these stories in family gatherings, that's not cool. Like, oh yeah, you know, your oldest brother was called the N-word and like came home and we thought it was so funny. He was like, he wanted to be white because he couldn't speak English too, right? So he wanted to drink milk because someone told him that if he drank milk, he would be white. Wow. And like, if you see those commercials back then, it was like subconsciously that's what they were saying. It was like, and it affected him as a young person. I remember hearing those stories. Another story was like that I fell off of the bed and I was like, really? And that I was almost taken away because they thought abuse was happening in my house. And I was like, oh, little did they know that it was not physical abuse, but it was verbal abuse in different ways. And we'll leave that story there for later. And we moved when I was like 3, between the ages of 3 or 5, I can't recall, but moved to Florida, and that was like all I remember is sandy beaches. So like that was half my life, was my memory of Florida and just swimming, you know, and being a young girl. And then around the 1990, we moved to Spokane. So that was like middle school and high school. Tried as hard as possible to go anywhere in the country, but for some reason the pool of family, and I ended up going to WSU, go Cougs. Stayed there, and from being in a military background, I was kind of, I hated moving. I forgot to say, like in Florida, we lived in 2 different places. So, and between Florida and going to Spokane, we lived in a motel for a reason. I don't even recall like why we live in a motel for so dang long in Airway Heights. but it was like realized that we're semi-homeless, and I didn't realize till later, like when you're working with homeless folks, you're like, oh, these are the moments that I was homeless, but as a person of color, you never see yourself as homeless because you're taken in some ways, or you feel taken care of, at least for me. So fast forward, WSU is a rural town, for folks that don't know that, in Pullman, Washington. Learned a lot about agriculture and different things, and that formed my identity. And then we fast forwarded to like I knew tons of people at WSU. A lot of people at WSU were folks of color that came from Seattle because they wanted their families to get away. And so one of the biggest things of recruiting people to WSU from urban areas was like getting away from large families, especially folks that were immigrants, of like, because your responsibility was like taking care of your family versus educating yourself. And then they would bring their younger siblings there. It's like, okay, we'll continue this taking care of, but in an, you know, like we're focusing on academics versus feeding families. Another thing was like getting away from violence, you know, or being influenced in that way. And so it was interesting community at WSU, especially because during that time ethnic studies was booming. I learned so much at ethnic studies, and I got politicized in a very rural area. Learned a lot about like gay bashing, learned a lot about black people being beat up, which is mob mentality, which is very scary, to like Colfax, which is 30 minutes away, which was like in the 1970s was like the last time a black person was hung in the state of Washington. Wow. So that kind of formed my identity. And then coming fast forward, plus like when I was in high school in Spokane, was there was like cross burnings, I remember, on mixed race like lawns, to like the Ku Klux Klan, not the Ku Klux Klan, but like Aryan Nation folks trying to march in Coeur d'Alene, which is 30 minutes away. So like it was like in the back of my head, and like sharing stories with people that are from Eastern Washington in that area of like, you know, the Klan is not that far away. The Aryan Nation is not that far away. People think that's a very southern thing, but it's just outside the borders of Seattle. And that was my experience in middle school and high school of like, you know, running into skinheads, you know, like normal things, and just be safe and just be chill. And then coming to Seattle, which was a very different experience of like, it was my first urban experience. And both my parents are real country. And and here I am, and you heard all the things that I did earlier. The list.
So you moved with your family to Seattle?
No, I moved by myself. I had 2 suitcases, and I was just like, got a job in AmeriCorps, which is like, man, that's not in existence anymore. And that was like, what that was life-changing in many ways. What it stood for, there was many critiques of it, but it was like an entryway into a nonprofit world, right? Yeah. And building that industry. So I got a job at Edmonds Community College. I thought Edmonds was in Seattle, and they were confusing me. I was like, oh, and so I would take the bus for like an hour to come to Seattle to organize. I don't know if I would do that anymore. My commute right now is like 5 minutes to doing things, you know. But the Central District in Seattle is becoming very gentrified. But before, I was like taking the bus like an hour one way to go to work at Edmonds, and it felt like an hour the other way to like organize after work.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. So many parallels. I want to go all the way back to what year. What year did your father join the military? Because you said he was part of the last wave of folks who picked cotton, which is wow.
So I was born in 1978, so we'd have to subtract a little bit. But it was in high school, so he was really young. So it was in the 1970s.
Wow. And it's interesting
because like the cotton industry is still there.
Yeah.
So I apologize. You can edit all that out. But yeah, my dad. So I was born in 1978. So that means that it must have been 1960s or 1970s. But the fact is that there's cotton plantations. Yeah. I call them cotton plantations, but people just cotton farms.
Yeah.
So
so people wonder where your cotton comes from. You need to go do your research.
Right. So my parents grew up in Alexandria, Louisiana, in the middle of Louisiana, and my father grew up in a neighborhood called the Red Mill Oil Mill Quarters, and it was called the Oil Mill Quarters because it was an oil mill, and there was a similar to your father in Alabama. There was a military base that was there, And once the military base closed, once the oil mill closed, the city lost a lot of its jobs. And so that turned into high poverty, very African American neighborhood, other side of the tracks type of situation, where other side of the tracks is where white folk lived, and then this side of the track is where black folk live, and it was a sundown town back in the day. So yeah, interesting.
And you mean by sundown town is you needed to be back in that town by sundown.
Yep.
In your place.
Yep. Yep.
Or bad things happen.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so, but it goes back
That's a story that you need to tell.
Right.
Dear God. Because, like, that's interesting because, like, now people are like, oh, you're making so much of a fuss about Black Lives Matter. But, like, the only difference between now and a few years ago was the only thing is that we're talking about it in media platforms.
Right.
But it was happening. Right. And nobody oh, they killed somebody. You're not going to go and go to the cops because they're probably in on it, you know?
Right,
like,
exactly.
You're just like, just chilling.
Yeah.
Nah, my mind's blown, kind of. What I was going to mention about the cotton plantation is it's interesting being in the Northwest and families that are rooted here. But if you go down south, like, it's just normal. And I remember going to an event by C. Davita Ingram, and people were crying touching cotton. And I was just like, the last time I touched cotton, you know, because it was in my childhood, because we'd visit most summers, is my grandma's funeral. And I remember going to the cotton field, grabbing cotton, and it's still on my altar today. Is like, I just knew what cotton felt like, and there's something sacred about something that comes from the earth, but that caused so much, like, tragedy. One thing that's there now is if you call any cell phone, like you call the helpline, or usually it's somebody from considered a developing or a third world country. So you'll hear people from India, from the Philippines, but also you'll hear people with accents that are distinguished, like, linguistically as African American. That's mostly from southern towns. So where the military left is the industry of technology, specifically cell phones, specifically T-Mobile, you know, or I would have to do more research, but I was like, interesting. And like every time I call my cell phone, I was like, I get somebody from the Philippines or somebody from the South, you know, and wondering where those industries have moved, you know, where poverty is, right? And oftentimes people make fun, like comedians will make fun of like getting somebody online and not being able to talk to them. But mostly that's, you know, developing or third world countries. And now you start thinking about like, oh, where are our developing regions in the United States? We act as if the third world is out there when it's actually here in the belly of the beast in the United States.
Interesting. I noticed that, and I always thought it was because of a time difference thing. I don't know why I was associated with that. Not necessarily like outsourcing to India or the Philippines. That I figured it's cheaper, and so companies do that. But whenever it was someone with a southern accent, I thought, oh, okay, it must be time difference. I don't know. That's interesting. I never thought about it that way.
Yeah. John Eklof, we were talking to about the number of African American folks who came north to the Northwest specifically through the military.
Yeah.
Right? Because like your family, all of my family members on my father's side had some connection to the military. And that was, how do we get out of
the South,
Alexandria, Louisiana, and the Jim Crow South? And so that's super interesting. And so how long was your family in the military?
My dad got out in the 90s, but it was complicated. He didn't make rank somehow, and I didn't understand it. He's a janitor now, so he gets some benefits, but it's not a lot, right? So some people think when you think Air Force, it depends on the branch, but there's like, he was more like a foot soldier. So there's a lot of people in the military that do odd jobs that need to be done. And my dad didn't, he doesn't have this like large check that comes in every single month from the military. He gets veterans benefits, in regards to health benefits for him and my mother, but it's not like a lot, you know. And I think he's kind of lucky that way because my mother has a lot of health things going on, and her insurance, because she worked at a casino. So like thinking about their story and connection to me of like where I'm at, you know, that whole understanding of like class of like, do you work with your muscles or do you work with your mind or do you work with your fingers, like what body part is being strained. Both of them are like their bodies are like aching, but they're still working. My mom has had to quit because, you know, a couple of her toes got severed, and she has diabetes and, you know, heart, you know, like she's like only in her 50s and she has like heart conditions, her kidneys are failing, like all this stuff, you know, her body is like shutting down. And her coming from a rural area as well, so she came from like rice fields. Like, so when I didn't realize that until I went to go visit the Philippines. And so walking down the road, and she was just like, oh yeah, the rice is just put on the road where it's kind of a natural air dryer, you know, there's these mats and then you put the rice on top. And I'm like walking through Mexico City and Angeles, you know, and kind of like Los Angeles, right? But it's called Angeles City. You'll just see like lots of rice fields. So I'm like, here's my mother with rice fields and my dad with cotton fields, and like two rural kids meet in the Philippines on an Air Force base, like of course. And she was like a maid, and like many years later is like she thinks that she's coming to the United States where life is going to be different, but also like she's marrying this American man, and like he was not the prize, right? So the prize is to marry predominantly white men. So she was not treated well by Filipino people because she married a black man, and like her kids looked a certain way. Even when I went back to the Philippines, people would look at my skin, and they knew my older brother, because they all spoke Tagalog before they left, but none of us speak Tagalog anymore. And they looked at my skin, they're like, oh, it's a good thing that you're like not dark like your brother, and all these other things of like that colorism carrying on in all cultures. And fast forward to like just like looking at our bodies and how they're used, and like what a success looks like, you know, going from there and visiting there. They're still seen as more successful because my dad's a janitor. You know, we still have more money here in the United States, even though we're struggling. So we're like low income here, but I'm like, my parents are like, my dad's a janitor and he also drives a truck for a news outlet, Spokane news outlet. And my mother was working at the casino. So we went back to rural life because like Airway Heights is right by Spokane, and that's where the military base is. Once again, military bases are so marked, or small rural towns or developing countries are marked with this, right? So you have a Walmart, we have a casino, what up natives, what up indigenous folks, and then we have a military base, right? And then there's a prison that was built. So that's all Airway Heights is, and that's how people get their money. Get their money, you know, like I don't have no shame about that, but just like, you know, what they do for economic work.
That's interesting. And I would be remiss, and I don't know why this just clicked in my head. My cousin is half Filipino but has never met her mother, and so they came over, I want to say she was born early 90s, and so she was raised by my grandmother in Alexandria, Louisiana, and so she has no connection. Well, I assume that she has no connection to Filipino culture because she grew up in this very small rural town in Louisiana. And
you'd be surprised about where Filipinos end up in this diaspora.
right. And so I will definitely make sure that I directly send this episode to her because and it's.
That's interesting because that just is in the history of like Amerasians. So like there's an Amerasia organization. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it was like there's some acts that you have to look up. I was doing this when I was doing my studies for a master's, and I completely forgot. I was like blown away about international babies, right? So by military men, and there's this act where people that were born, and you could actually tell that they were like either half white or part black with Asian, where they could claim, you know, American ancestry And that was like almost like reparations in some ways of like, because these kids were being harmed, because this is where conquering happened, right? And so those kids were not treated well in some countries, and with compassion in other countries, you know, depending on how you see things. We'd have to pick up those stories, but they were allowed to advocate for their citizenship. And so there's tons of babies that are left all over the world by military men that they know that like these are not our kids, which is a more monolithic culture, right? I don't know if that act is still in place, but I mean, the whole idea of me becoming like anti-military and anti-imperialist is from a very concrete personal experience of like seeing what happens to Filipino women in working in mess halls on military bases. And it's just so weird how the conquered become absorbed inside of, you know, when we think about U.S. militarization harming the Philippines, and me being in between that, and like, what does the military mean for my family, you know, and like black people being recruited into military. And one thing I told some youth the other day was I remember this article coming out where there was this crisis in the military because too many black men were being educated, and so they were being recruited into higher education, and how that disrupt an industry, the military industrial complex. And we need to like look at that, right, of like, oh, our recruitment base within the black community, specifically black men, is like, and your choice as, you know, and when I see my father, it's like he made that choice, right? You either go into the military, you know, you go into sports, you know, that's the way out, or you're incarcerated, right? There's like these tracks that people were dragged into. And now that there's more opportunities, there's like this crisis of like, what's going to fuel our economy? Because like the prison class fuels our economy. The military fuels our economy. It's a mess.
It's a damn.
Yeah. I went to a high school where, you know, nowadays our college recruiters will come out and they're like, apply to our school, whatever. I went to Cleveland, and we had none of that. No college recruiters would come out. It was all military. And they would call us. They even called me several times. I'm like, I don't want to join. No.
Is this after the STEAM came in there? Is this?
No, this was prior. Yeah. That's the only type of recruiting because they said most of the students at the high school, they either dropped out or, you know, graduated but just went into the working world, or they joined the military. Like the percentage that actually enrolled and went to college was very low, and so that's why we had all just military recruiters coming through.
I mean, just to backtrack a little bit, like during this time of gentrification and the white flight back in, but one of the original white flights out, I mean, was in regards to the GI Bill. And still, like, even if people were not formally incarcerated, but back in the day, you know, getting this GI Bill, people that were African American were still shut out of that, and people advocating for that right. There's a history of African American and black soldiers, you know, from the Buffalo Soldiers, which was given like the status by indigenous people, like, because the way that they fought, because the wool of people's hair, and people think that was a derogatory term, but it was like indigenous people were like saying, we honor the way that black people fight, right? And this is the Buffalo Soldier. So from that moment, there's always been this fight of like, if I fight now, will I be an American? And people coming out of slavery from that moment, if we talk about black people, were recruited into the army and treated bad racially, right? I look back of like, what is my history as a black Filipino person, right? And it starts with the military. And so I was like, what is the history of black folks going into the military? And you look at these Calvaries, right, that were first segregated, but also like how black folks were recruited to be in the military to go to the Philippines specifically, because the Philippines was one of the first tropical places. It was the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and some other Pacific islands, and they talked about black people's physicality and like their bodies, and like, oh, they're used to working out in the suns in cotton plantations in a certain way, and like they can withstand the heat in a certain way. They're originally from Africa. Let's send them to the Philippines because we're losing here and they won't die here, right? And that led me down another road where I started thinking about in the Philippines, where there's General Fagan. More people know about him, but when I first found out about him, he was a general in the Filipino army. So he was recruited as a soldier and became a general in the Filipino army, where like 20 plus black soldiers defected and went into the Filipino army because the Filipinos were like, yo, my brother, they were like, my black brother, I think it was like my Negro brother, because that was like the term back then of saying like, please come and fight with us, like you are not free in the United States, you know, and there is no guarantee that you're going to be free. And so they're like, come fight with us, because our struggles is like yours. And it's interesting, like looking at those documents of like Ida B. Wells, who people think was only an anti-lynch person, but she was also an anti-imperialist, along with like Mark Twain, who, you know, people famously know as a writer, but they don't see his stuff that he wrote about the Philippines. You know, you go deeper, like they were saying, no, you should stop, you know, trying to conquer other places when there's a Negro problem here in the United States. And then there was another voice within media, right? We're talking about media outlets, right. news articles saying like, we can't link every single black struggle to every other brown person around the world. So you have like powerful Ida B. Wells saying like, don't do this, and other people saying like, okay, we're black folks, you know, and like that struggle still carries on today, where it's like, can black people just do for black people, or should black people be in solidarity? Because what people have done to black people, they carried over and they exported that, starting with the Philippines, starting with Puerto Rico, and that was their model of like how they could colonize other countries. It was like, look how we colonize these black folks to work for us. Can we go export that to overseas? Right. You know, so
damn.
That's all I have to say.
Damn. That's so deep. I don't even know how to go back.
I don't either.
So
sorry, this is just on my mind all the time, because I'm like, I come from, you know, when you said I come from a military family, like these are the things that are on my mind as a mixed race person. You know, some other people talk about being like, I'm part white and this and that. I was like, that's not my experience. I'm like, I need to, you know, meet other black and Filipino people and like share the story of like, what does it mean to be part of two people that are historically have been conquered or colonized.
Right.
You know.
So when you came to Seattle, where were you as far as like just your thought process, and did you know what you wanted to do? Like, what cultures were you surrounded by? Did you go through any culture shock?
When I was leaving WSU, when I was a senior, before I got my master's, I was like, I'm leaving. I need a network. And so one of the organizations I joined was Delta Sigma Theta, Sorority Incorporated. I had to lift my shoulder there, Incorporated. You know, the red and the white, the triangle, the tried and true. 1913, shout out to I have to do a shout out, sorry. I was like, what up, bros? What up, Soros? You know, spring 2000, Xi Psi, core chapter, seven images of a new era. So that was me. I was number 5 on the line. Came to Seattle, and I knew black folks, and then I was like part of the Filipino American Student Association.
Shout out to FASA.
Yep, FASA and Siga FASA. And it was like the Northwest Filipino American Student Association was like tearing things up, so I knew people from different places. So I came here and I was already embedded in culture, and I had already gone to like different workshops in regards to Filipino resistance. And so that was on the build up. This was before Bayan USA was Bayan USA and Bayan Northwest. So people were working in solidarity. I had just gone on an exposure trip to the Philippines in like 2005. I can't remember, 2004. And I had graduated in 2005. So an exposure trip is like when you go and you're integrated into a community and like learn about language and culture and resistance. So come here, and I'm like, I had just finished my master's too, of like talking about all those things I talked about. I was like discovering all these new things about my heritage and identity and what it meant to be me as a Filipino black person. So most of the work I've always done has been solidarity work or community partnerships if it's in the nonprofit world. So I like jumped in and was like always thinking about what does it mean to bring artists, for example, into educational conversations at Edmonds Community College. Like, what does it mean to have community partners in an academic institution and that close that gap of like, where does the community start and the academic institution begin? And starting like hip hop shows, but having tablers there, something that I did. You know, people didn't do that back in the day as much. You know, we started doing that through Ladies First and other organizations, just building on the knowledge that I already had and like was hungry for knowledge of like, I had this book knowledge in my head, and then people were on the ground and they like added, and by the way, incarceration is messed up. I was like, what? And, you know, so I was like meeting folks from CARA and like at the time, I'm trying to recall the organization, Home Alive. I was like, just met people from Home Alive. I jumped into a project called Queer People of Color Liberation Project, which I forgot to mention earlier, where I'm like, I discovered that I was like, I was like, my identity was so hard. I was just like, just trying to survive. And I was actually a good Christian girl until I always, you know, term that in quotations, but I discovered that I was a queer person. I was like, and it was just wasn't safe for me to be that in a rural area, and I had suppressed that deep inside. So things were just exploding for me in like 2005, and I was just hungry, right? I was hungry to build. I was hungry for knowledge. And over the years, I learned that I was like one of those eager beaver people. And I totally look around me now and I see people coming out of college and asking me questions about what does this mean? What does this mean? Or just asking me about different history here in Seattle. Cause I'm like, I dig deep, you know, I'm like, I came here when I was in college too, like just visiting with friends. And I was like, it doesn't look like it used to look, you know. I came here for like Black festivals and Black parades. I remember being in Delta and like strolling down the street, you know, with my flaring my red and white and black, and there's surrounded by Black folks, right? The streets were surrounded. I remember, and I was like, this is so much joy being surrounded by Blackness. And now like coming back to Seattle was like, in 2005, it was just like gentrification had started to happen, you know. People were talking about the light rail. People were talking about the Filipino Community Center and fighting for it to be there so that the light rail didn't be, you know, in the middle of it, so that there was a station right there. And, you know, just came in swinging, I guess, like Muhammad Ali, you know. I don't know. You know, building on some knowledge. And I was like, I had just read books too about like you know, Carlos Bulosan. This is before the centennial was here. Now it's like a known thing, but I'm like, before, like, we had just started reading, people talk about the Filipino Renaissance and like Isang Mahal being on the build-up. This Isang Mahal was like the organization that jump-started You Speaks, which people don't even know, right? Don't even know that history of like where that came from. And I'm sitting here like reading this book, like Home is Where the Heart Is, and I'm like, oh, you look up and that's the street where Carlos Bulosan was chilling. That's the hotel? Really? You know, this is before his mural was everywhere. You know, his face was everywhere. And I'm like, you just read a book and you're like, oh, you know, just reading. I came from college just having met like Octavia Butler. I'm like, oh, Octavia Butler is over here. Oh, Bruce Lee's gravesite over here. And I was like, wow, Seattle, and like meeting people that didn't even know the history of their own town, you know. I'm like looking at it with fresh eyes, or meeting elders or people like, you should meet this person so you could get some knowledge. Go to Life Enrichment Books, or you meet Vicky at festivals where she's dragging, and you know, shout out and may she rest in peace, of like she's dragging her books to different festivals saying like, yes, read this, little sister, you know. Just amazingness, you know.
Well, and I'm glad you bring this up. Like we were just podcasting and thinking about like, yes, Seattle is a super white city and has been a super white city for a while, but there's so much great history when it comes to talking about folks of color in the city.
Yes.
And there's so many amazing folks that have come through the city and changed, like, just changed it, like, for the better, and just built and innovated on everything that was here. And so when I think about even just the Central District, like, I don't know what Seattle would be without the Central District and the innovations that the Central District
jazz
brought.
hello.
And that's before we start talking about the South End and all of those communities and the Japanese community that has been on Beacon for quite some time. And so it's
even the story of jazz in the whole nation, right? Because Seattle was an integrated, not really legally, but it was like people turned the other way when people were, you know, in clubs, mixing socially, right? When we look at early days of like people even interracial marriage, it was between folks of color, right? So we have the Indopino, like indigenous folks and Filipinos. We have Mexicans and Filipinos. Everybody in Filipinos. I'm kidding. But even that history of like people started talking about mixed race later, but I'm like, that was like way back in the jazz days, you know? There's Chinese black folks back in the day, like, because Chinese folks were doing jazz. And that influenced the whole nation in regards to jazz, you know, and that influenced the whole world in regards to jazz, and that started here. Or just the history of like sex workers being unionized, right? Like our foundation of Seattle is based on what people said were seamstress. I don't know if you know this. And they were actually, and people say it as a joke on the underground tour, but I'm like, that's some economic power when we talk about who sex workers were, you know. And they're like, okay, we'll give you a little bit of change and we'll loan you out some money so your little city, colonized city, will still run. Or the history of tribalism of like, there's still tribes that are intact trying to fight for recognition. And what does that mean for 500 plus indigenous nations of this land? You know, Seattle is bomb. Like, sometimes when people are like, oh, Seattle's whack, I'm like, you're not digging deep enough. Like, when I came here, I feel like it was right before the big tech boom, and I was like, I got to see the beauty of the city. And so it hurts my heart when people come in and they're like, ooh, where are all the black people? I'm like, the black people are, I'm like, because you're here, you know, like, you can afford to move here to Seattle and reap this benefit of culture, and the people that created it are now gentrified, you know. I'm like, where do we go? Like, dig deeper, learn the history, know the beauty, like, make the connections, like, know the people that were trying to build solidarity amongst people, you know. And it's not just the dudes, right? I'm like, shout out to Uncle Bob. I love Uncle Bob, and you know, the Gang of Four.
Shout out to Auntie Dorothy too.
Auntie Dorothy. But like Auntie Dorothy, for example, was holding down Cindy Domingo, you know, and shout out to her Black Filipino kids. You know, you know, the Black Panthers, and you know, the
Charlene Williams.
Yeah, the Filipino. I forgot. Why am I forgetting? I feel bad. I feel the Filipino Socialist Party. It was not. That's not the official name, but it was like they're on a socialist bent. You know, they were, you know, causing ruckus. You know, and you know, I'm like forgetting all the uncles now. Larry, you know, Gary Owens, you know, being raised in the International District, you know, people like used to walk down, you know, like they were right next to each other. People were like talking to each other, and like here's you know, the International District, here's Chinatown, here's Little Saigon, here's you know, Queer Hill, here's you know, the Black community. We're smushed up against each other, and people influenced each other.
Yes.
And they were talking, you know, creating culture, as we said earlier. They're creating culture with music, with language, with, you know, food, you know.
Shout out to all of the jazz musicians that that come from this city, like all the folks that play jazz, and for that reason, like, even we were talking about in an episode, like, just the Washington Middle School, Garfield High School, and their jazz programs. It doesn't happen without the history of jazz that was in this city,
and the history of hip hop that was born out of that. Right. On those same jazz on Jackson streets.
Absolutely.
You know.
Yeah.
And people in 206 Zulu and other places will tell you that hip hop, you know, if you look at Cool Out TV, like, that was another circuit. Like, people are like, who was listening to hip hop? and Seattle having a specific flavor and sound, you know,
Mm-hmm.
that Macklemore is like banking on right now. But you need to talk to like folks like A-Sun or Santonio Banderas and Julie C and folks from Alpha P. They'll tell you what those roots are, or like Jason Black and
Yep. Shout out to Jace.
Felicia Loud,
Shout out to
she's
Felicia.
speaking about jazz,
Yes,
These,
yes.
I mean, like, when I think about coming to Seattle, these are the folks that influence me, right? Like, I was like here I am at Ladies First, like trying to get this conversation about rape started in the city of Seattle that I don't know that well, and like getting influenced by Theron and other and Ebony and other and Sandra, who was big in like the burlesque scene, right? And like them like molding me, like talking about positive sex, like respecting sex workers, understanding rape culture, and then them like shooting me off with this project of like learning about hip hop and using hip hop as a vehicle in which to not say that rape, saying that hip hop or rap causes rape, because that was that stigma on black folks, versus like this is the conversation we need to have within hip hop and using hip hop as a vehicle, and people being on stages, seeking out and listening to, Silent Lambs project, and other folks. And like, it was just such a different time. And I felt like I was like navigating through all these communities, and I still do. But, sitting here and reflecting with you all, I'm like, whoa, I forgot that happened, and it was like, I did feel alive, I felt like people were wonderful and possible.
Right.
Because Seattle was great, because you learn from people that were in Seattle, that love Seattle,
Right.
and they loved it so much that they would tell you the truth about yourself in their city. Even have to shout out to like Gabriel Teodros, because he taught me a lot about hip hop, specifically in the city of Seattle. Wow, that's
real.
It's such a wild ride here.
Where do you feel like you found your voice, or did you always feel like you had it?
That's a good question, because I'm like trying to teach other people. It's through youth and young adults, right? That bravery of saying, like, when you tell a young person that they could do anything and you stand by them and you watch them do it, you're like, I wish somebody would have told me that, right? And you're like, well, I'm saying that now, I have to do that. Right. So I would say like I've always been a worker bee, but when I found my own voice, I would say, wow, I completely forgot that I did this. Bent Writing Institute. My specific voice in regards to being a writer and saying my truth, if it's about that artistry. But I feel like I've always, backtracking a little bit, when I think I was a worker bee, I've always been a really big listener, I feel like later on I learned to interrupt people more, which was hard because I'm still trying to find that balance. That's different than having a voice, but it's like when you feel like you've been disempowered for so long, you're like, oh, and like wanting to add. But when I think about my unique voice, and which I'm still scared of, and when you have a writing community, shout out to Tara Hardy, who founded Bent Writing Institute, she kind of still calls me to this day. That's like a community teacher, community educator. And you can see her building. She's like, I want to hear your voice. And you believe her, and other people like Garfield Hilson, who's always been a friend of mine. But it feels scary to have that kind of voice of like, talk about your vulnerability. I feel like I've always had an academic voice, which is like, let me tell you about this unknown history, because it's like, this history is about me and it's not out there. I know it's not in a book because I had to do a lot of research, so I definitely feel like that happened when I was like searching out my master's. I was like, just had this urge to tell everybody about this knowledge. Later on, is interesting, through Seattle Young People's Project, they had this training for trainers too. So when I think about myself as a facilitator specifically, so Bent Writing Institute was like me as a poet, but they were doing this training for trainers. So it was like, how do you become a facilitator? How do you teach youth, right? So that was like Seattle Young People's Project in connection to the youth and young adult program at API, which was at API Chaya. And that honed my skill of like reading a room and like learning how to facilitate well, of like, how do you hold hardship? How do you hold trauma in a certain way? And after a while, the only way that you can get better at it is like continuing to try and fail. And like one day you will fail and fail big still, regardless of how much skill you have, because people are so diverse. And but it also feels good when you can find liberation in a room, or people find their own voice. And it's through, with facilitation, that's not really finding your voice, but asking the right questions so that other people can be heard. Then later on, when I think about me being a public speaker, I was like, okay, I got surprised. People started asking me to just tell my life story. And they were like, I'll give you like $500 or $1,000. And then I started being asked, like, I bet 5 years ago, to like even go back to WSU and like tell the story, you know, like this orator of like, tell the story of like, you know, why Black Women's Caucus, why is that important here? You know, why WCA at WSU become what it is, or Coalition of Women Students. And then when I think of radio specifically, when learning about media justice and Ladies First specifically, and that connection, and shout out to like Sabrina Roach, who brought the term to me, but it was like in connection to Allied Media Conference, you know, where specifically I asked this idea of like being in a room and being able to tell stories with each other. It was a whole other way of finding your voice. And then all of a sudden I find myself like on buses and in comics, and people wanting to hear my opinion about things. And that's when my voice got really scary again, and I'm like trying to find it. I think for me, I know some people are very prolific, and I'm like, oh my God, those poets that can say whatever they want. And there's moments where I just need to continuously have someone asking me to do my art as a writer. And so coming back to that voice that I tried to discover in Bent Writing Institute here in Seattle is really important to me, because I feel like I need to get things off of the page and like be more vulnerable. And back to the beginning of this conversation is like discovering who I am in connection to fear, because I feel like people think that when you become older you become fearless somehow. The only thing that we do is like we don't become less afraid, we just learn how to navigate society and cover things up a little bit better.
That's real.
So
That's real.
yeah, that was a long answer.
No, not at all.
I like it. How did you become a writer, and is that what led you into teaching?
How did I become a writer? I work at Seattle Girls School. I was going to give an assignment. I was taking over for the language arts teacher temporarily, you know, as a long-term sub. And I had to start journaling. So I looked in my shelves and I found my old journals. So I can answer this question. Yes. And I found like my journals from middle school. Wow. And I didn't have a voice. And I found like I would make lists. I started out with that and the English teacher. And I know that's why I force students to still journal. It's so important. And studies show that just writing, even if when you have no thoughts at all, of just saying, I have no thoughts, you know, is important, and to give students options. But I have these journals from like 6th grade all the way up to high school. And I kept them in a binder, and I have them in the drawer of my house. They've come with me all the way from like Spokane to college to here. And I looked through them and I like wrote these poems before they started rhyming. I also remember like specific essays. I wouldn't say these out loud because that's not how school was back then. You wouldn't really read your poetry out loud. I can't recall that. Making a story about Greek mythology. And it was about the god. It was like a farting, like how wind came to be, and there's this god farting. Back to our yeah, and I was just like, and it just made me smile. Like I remember writing. That was the first time I remember writing, being joyful about writing, right? Yeah. And it was an important moment. Later on, when I went to college, I continued to write, and I would write these. I was just so sad. I just kept on writing poetry. And then I finally said my poem out loud, and I was like, oh my God, this is the longest thing ever. And it was something personal, and I was like, oh. And the line that I remember that a lot of people liked was like, I said, will I trip back over this colored line? And that was in connection to me trying to find a partner and thinking like, well, who will I marry? Will I marry a black person, or will I date a black person, or will I date a Filipino person? And being really confused about like wanting to build culture, and that being through family, and like feeling like as the next generation of me or whatever that looked like was going to be diluted. And that bringing me great sadness. Like, how do I hold so much? And if the next generation, my nephews specifically, and they're like Italian and white, you know, all these different ethnicities, and like, how do they carry on all three of those cultures? Can they do that? Is that important? Are we going to be assimilated? And it feels like people making judgments over our bodies like we were already traitors, you know, by being born, you know, and our parents were traitors, and they'd already crossed that racial barrier that they weren't supposed to cross. So what was our job? So I remember saying that poem out loud at some potluck, you know, some random college potluck. When I went into my master's program, I was like, I realized now I could say this. I was like really traumatized. Like, other people would be like intellectualizing some of this, and it was like, I didn't have access. Now people have access to learning about this in middle school or elementary school, and we have a different generation. But I remember it was the first time I was like, I was supposed to be professional in a master's program, and people were like being critical in this different intellectual way, and people from all over the world, and I was sitting there like, black people were raped? Like, I didn't hear about that, you know. Like, it started with that, but I was just like, in my head I was like, oh my God, this happened to my people, you know. Like, not just that we were slaves, but there's other things that happened. And I was like, did I really have to pay for this? Now, like, education is more free, but I'm like, learning about what happened in slavery in more details, you know, more advanced books. I was like, ugh. And all I could do was write about the pain in poetry form. And my master's program, the person, the chair of my master's committee said like, yo, Linda didn't talk like this. She was like this rad queer Chicana person, and she was like, you know what? She was like, if that's what you need to just keep writing your poetry. But she was from that hardcore generation of like coming from LA and other places, like, that's a valid voice. And she's like, then you can slap the academics around it, but write what you feel. And so I really recall those specific things of like my journey. Like, I still have those pieces with me, right? And I feel like I'm still continuing the journey, like you said, of like all the things I mentioned earlier of like, where am I going now? And I feel like even today, before I got here, I'm still asking the same question of like, where is my voice? Am I being honest about my voice? Is it scarier to be as truthful because I'm an adult and I have more to lose, you know? Because when you go to Youth Speaks events, you hear the youth, you know, the youth right now, the truth right now, and you're like, they get to spit that truth, and you're like, thank God, you know. It's like, will they end up like me or other people where there's too many things to think through in your head before you write something on the page? Like, you're like, will I lose my job? Will, you know, who will care? Will this ruin, you know, I'm always thinking in advance of like things end up being economic, right? And I know that's not for everybody, but for me, I'm like, sometimes I stand out already, you know. I'm a big girl, so, you know, not very typical. So I'm like, sometimes I'm like, even right now as I'm trying to talk and explain it, I'm like, it's just hard to put your truth out there fearlessly.
Right.
You know.
Right. How did you become a teacher?
My friend called me up.
We need a teacher.
I thought I was going to be a teacher, so I was really good at writing. Like I told you, I was journaling. So I went to college thinking I was recruited by Future Teachers of Color. Shout out to Milton Lang, who was my recruiter, right? He was just like, I did not know anything about college. He was the person that told me, like, I called him up and was like, what's financial aid? I don't even know, you know? That was not a thing. So I was in this program called Future Teachers of Color. Some things happened where didn't have a good experience. I had some racial experiences that just shut me down. And so I never finished my teaching degree. And then I went into another. I was that kid that was in every single program to get me where I need to go, every single governmental program. So the other program was the Ronald E. McNair program.
Shout out to the
That was like,
scholarship.
I was one of the first like prototypes or whatever, like the first cohorts.
Wow.
And I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't think I'm going to become a teacher. I basically applied for that program, got my master's. I was like, I'm gonna be a professor. And I was like, damn, this is really, really hard. I'm like, I'm just gonna take a sojourn into AmeriCorps. I'm like, man, this is not paying a lot of money. I have some loans, and I'm like, all of a sudden I just jumped into the nonprofit world, and I was like, I was teaching, but it was like grassroots styled. So that's how I became a community educator. My friend calls me up and was like, I'm leaving my position at Seattle Girls School. I'm calling folks and telling them to apply for this position. So shout out to Anastasia Talbert, who was known as Miss A. And I was like, okay, I'll apply, because she wanted to pursue her artwork, her performance arts. So I applied, and she had set the foundation the year before for the program. It was like the first year that she did it, and the year that I was coming in was the second year. I just ended my second year as a performance studies teacher at Seattle Girls School, and reflecting back on my little summer vacation in this moment in July, I was like, woo, that was hard. And I still love teaching youth and young adults, and I have this moment where I get to learn something new, and I go back to that. It was like the dream deferred, right? Like I was meant to become a teacher, and I feel like, kind of like the Dixie Chicks, I'm taking the long way around, taking the long road. Yes. Shout out to the Dixie Chicks,
yes.
who were kind of the resistors in, the country scene.
Right.
So for the folks that are haters around country, they just performed Daddy's Lessons with Beyonce. Hey. When the good people start connecting their genres.
Yes.
I bet Beyonce messed those country folks up. Like, yeah, I can do country,
And bam, here it is.
With the
Black folks have been
with the Dixie Chicks, of course.
Black folks have been doing country.
That's true. That's true. The blues. That's
Sang the
true.
blues, goddamn.
I know. Black folks ever.
How do you take care of self-preservation? Like, how do you take care of yourself mentally?
I think it's a day-by-day thing. I encourage people to go to counseling.
Shout out to my counselor.
I know. I've done generative somatics, which I need to get back to, where you learn, what is your body, how does your body respond to traumatic situations, and how are you carrying that into, your meetings and other things, your work environment, and how can you shift that in your body's reaction. There's hip-hop, there's my nails. My nails are everything. My nails are everything. I just love them. My life is going well when my nails are done. When they're not, you're like, what's going on?
That's right.
When I'm cooking food and I'm preserving it, dancing is great. I still dance with my good one foot, my one good foot, because my other one is broken. My ankle's broken. No. What I said earlier is when you learn how other people learn, I feel like I'm going to be challenged for the rest of my life, of continuously, our world is changing more rapidly. So that's preserving. It's just by preserving our educational system and asking young people new types of questions, that'll preserve all of us.
No doubt.
Yeah.
No doubt.
Yeah.
And how can people get connected?
You can just look up #Lulu Nation. There's one other woman somewhere in Africa somewhere. Her name is Lulu too, so you'll see the distinction.
Shout out to the Lulu in Africa.
I know. I know. I've been running into a lot of people called Lulu, so just know, before it was me and a bunch of old grandmas. Now this new generation, people are Lulus. I'm like, what?
Wait a minute.
That was unique. No one was Lulu before.
At the real Lulu.
I met somebody. I was like, I know. At Pride, and I was like, you're Lulu? And they're like, I think I gave them a death look. And I was like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I'm trying to be nice, but in your old age, you get mean. Where can they find me? In the park somewhere being mean?
or dancing.
Or dancing.
One of the two.
I'm usually at Coleman Park for the summer, so call me up on a floaty device. Yeah, I'm always down for a barbecue. That's how you can find me. Call me and feed me, and you'll be able to find me.
Damn, that's simple.
Yeah, and uzuri.consulting.productions@gmail.com. So that's Uzuri is UZURI. And then you can find Lulu Nation and the crew on Facebook, on SoundCloud, on Instagram.
Nice.
Yep.
Nice. Well, thank you so much.
And on the side of the bus.
And you were one of the strangers, most influential people to know.
It was person of interest.
Person of interest.
Person of interest. Yes. And then we have 2 Seattle Weekly comics with E.T. Russian, where she outlined some of our talk shows.
Okay, so there'll be links to all of this in the description.
Really? Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
That's
well,
so
thank
cool.
you so much. This is so awesome.
Thank you.